sun is blazing in the sky, beating down on the dusty streets of Langtry, Texas. It's the early 1890s, and this little town, perched atop the Rio Grande on the edge of the harsh Chihuahuan desert, is buzzing with a mix of excitement and a bit of fear. Inside the Jersey Lilly Saloon, the air is thick with anticipation. This isn't just any saloon. It doubles as the courthouse, and the judge isn't your typical judge. He's more like a Wild West dime novel character brought to life. And despite the title, he's not exactly a stickler for the law. So picture this. The judge, weathered face, sharp eyes, long white beard, sits behind the bar. Right next to him, chained to a post where a modern-day bailiff would sit, is his pet bear, Bruno. Yeah, you heard that right. The walls are decorated with pictures of Lilly Langtry, the British actress the bar is named after. It gives the place a weird bit of class to go along with the border town roughness. Suddenly, the saloon doors swing open, and in walk two Texas Rangers. They're carrying a stretcher with the body of a man who has fallen from a railroad bridge. Next to him are his belongings, $40 and a revolver. The judge reps his .41 Smith & Wesson on the bar to get everyone's attention. The ranger captain steps forward. He explains that the man died from the fall, and the Rangers, after investigating, believe it was an accident. The judge picks up an old dusty law book and opens it, glancing through it. He doesn't read it, not really. It's really there more for show and to give some sort of officiality to these proceedings. He glances at the body, then toward the Rangers. "Where was the weapon found?" The two men look at each other. "It was found in his pocket, Your Honor." The judge looks at the crowd and smirks. "Carrying a concealed weapon is against the law. This man, God rest his soul, has offended the great state of Texas by committing this crime on her sacred soil. I hereby find him..." The judge trails off, squinting at the gold pieces lying next to the man, trying to count them from across the room. $40? He glances up at the lawman, and the captain gives a quick nod. "I find him $40. Now, Captain, please help this gentleman out by remitting his fine to the court." The ranger captain smirks and places the money on the bar in front of the judge. With a practiced ease, the judge sweeps the money into his own pocket. The Rangers, used to this kind of behavior in this court, nod to the judge and go on their way. The judge reaches into the same pocket and flips a quarter to a man sitting at a table nearby nursing a beer. "Domingo, when you finish that one, drag him down to the cemetery and let's get him in the ground." As the sun begins to set over the barren landscape, the room transforms from courthouse back to saloon, judge into bartender. Whiskey flows, card games are played, laughter, and the occasional fight stretched long into the night. This is Judge Roy Bean's domain. He is eccentric and authoritarian, brilliant and baffling, lawkeeper and criminal. But love him or fear him, you'd better get along with him, because he is the law west of the Pecos. It says so right outside. Hey y'all, I'm Jody Slaughter, and welcome to West Texas, where the sky stretches on forever and the stories are as vast and rugged as the landscape itself. On this program, we will explore the characters who have etched their names into the sun-bleached history of this region. From outlaws and lawmen to everyday folks who dared to dance with destiny, we'll explore the legends, the truths, and the tall tales that define this undefinable region. First up, Judge Roy Bean. Was he a champion of justice or a maverick that wrote his own set of rules? So grab a seat, kick off your boots, and settle in, because this is West Texas. So how did a man like Bean, an outlaw by all accounts, with no formal education to speak of, rise to wield so much power in this remote corner of Texas? To find that out, we've got to rewind back to 1835, when Fantley Roy Bean Jr. was born in Mason County, Kentucky. Youngest of 5 brothers, maybe even 3. Details about his early life are very murky. But one thing's for sure, his family wasn't exactly rolling in dough. So at the age of 16, with dreams of adventure and a brighter future, Roy hopped on a flatboat and headed down the Mississippi River to New Orleans, where his brother Sam lived. Think Huckleberry Finn for the kind of vibe that this trip would have been. He didn't last long in New Orleans, though. After a bar fight in the French Quarter and not sure if their opponents were alive or dead, Roy and Sam hightailed it out of there, heading for Texas. In 1848, they even tried setting up a trading post in Mexico, but that went south too. Turns out Roy wasn't exactly a business magnate. One night while he was having himself a drink, a drunk Mexican desperado announced to anyone who would listen that he wanted to kill a gringo. Roy, never one to back down from a fight, shot the guy dead, claiming self-defense. Mexican authorities didn't buy it, and they put out a warrant for his arrest. So Roy headed west again, this time to San Diego, California, to meet up with his other brother, Joshua. Now, Joshua Bean, he was a whole other story himself. Joshua served under Zachary Taylor in the Mexican-American War and even rose to the rank of Major General in the California militia, earning the nickname, and I love this, General Frijoles. He helped put down some Native American uprisings during the gold rush and even became the first mayor of San Diego when California became a state in 1850. But his time in office didn't last long after he sold City Hall and a bunch of other city land to himself and his best buddy after a night of drinking. So Joshua, now it's his turn to flee. He ends up in Los Angeles, where he opens a saloon across the street from the Mission San Gabriel. Roy, meanwhile, stayed in San Diego and turned into quite the charmer with the ladies. Life seemed pretty good for a while until things went sideways in early 1852. A Scotsman named John Collins challenged Roy to a duel on horseback. Roy, ever the risk taker, agreed, and Collins even told him that he could choose the targets that they shot at. So obviously Roy chose for their targets each other. Now, Roy wasn't the best shot, but he did manage to graze the Scotsman. Both of them got arrested for assault and attempted murder. Roy spent a few months behind bars, but he wasn't exactly lonely. The local ladies doted on him, bringing him flowers, food, and even cigars. Sounds like quite the prison experience to me. One admirer even snuck him some knives hidden in tamales. Talk about resourceful. And Roy, ever the opportunist, almost immediately used those knives to dig a hole in his cell wall. And in April 1852, he escaped, making it up to Mission San Gabriel to reunite with Joshua. Now, Joshua's saloon there, called the Headquarters, was a happening place, and he hired Roy as his bartender. Things were going smoothly, or so it seemed, until a chilly night in November 1852. Roy was behind the bar when 5 gunshots shattered the peace outside. The Los Angeles Star reported on the crime. Quote, General J.H. Bean was most basely assassinated on the night of Sunday last, near the Mission of San Gabriel. He was shot in the right breast, the ball taking an upward direction and passing entirely through him, from which wound he languished about 24 hours and until 2 o'clock the morning of Tuesday. By whom the deed was committed appears to be shrouded in the deepest mystery, and although the coroner's jury has been unceasing in its endeavors to gain some clue to the murderer, success seems as distant as ever. End quote. Now, the number one suspect of anyone you asked around the Mission that day would have been Felipe Reed, the adopted son of Hugo Reed, a wealthy landowner in the area. He had been involved in a very public rivalry with Joshua Bean over the affections of a woman. Now, due to Joshua's standing in the military and the community, a vigilance committee was formed to investigate his murder. Now, to imagine what this is, it's basically a glorified lynch mob with maybe a little government oversight, but not really. Now, the vigilance committee's investigation, if you can call it that, was swift and brutal. They arrested Reed first, but his friends soon arrived and gave him an alibi. They also arrested a gang of local desperados who had been terrorizing the area for some time. There's really no evidence linking any of these men to Bean's murder, but it made a convenient excuse to round them up and get rid of them. Now, the last man arrested was a respected cobbler named Cipriano Sandoval. Sandoval maintained his innocence, testifying that, sure, he had been in the area, heard the shots, but he had seen Felipe Reed fleeing. He also testified that Reed had confessed to the murder and paid him $5 to keep quiet about it. Reed, of course, denied all of this. The committee sentenced Sandoval and the 4 desperados to death while setting Reed free. Reed would eventually confess to the murder on his deathbed. Okay, so now without getting sidetracked, Roy Bean was now the proud owner of the Headquarters Saloon, but that success, like about everything else he did, was short-lived. In 1854, in a tale straight out of a Johnny Cash song, a young woman he was courting was kidnapped and forced to marry a Mexican military officer. Outraged, Roy rode out to the officer's camp and challenged him to a duel. A little more skilled with a pistol than when he had dueled the Scotsman in San Diego, Roy killed the officer. But for his troubles, he was immediately assailed by 6 of the officer's men, put on horseback with a noose tied from a tree to his neck, and left to hang when the horse decided to move. If you've ever seen the Mel Gibson Western movie Maverick, you can pretty well envision this scene. In a stroke of luck for Roy, the horse stood fast, and the woman he had dueled over arrived, cutting him free. He survived the hanging, but the noose left a scar around his neck that he would carry for the rest of his life. So after having had enough of California, Roy decided to venture to the New Mexico territory, where his brother Samuel had just been made sheriff of Dona Ana County, living near Las Cruces. Roy arrived destitute, but was made a partner in his brother's saloon and dry goods store. He found a successful life for a while, until the outbreak of the Civil War. Invading Texian armies are apparently bad for business. And after the Confederates were defeated at the Battle of Glorieta Pass in March 1862, their supply wagons were taken and they retreated to San Antonio. Well, Roy, sensing an opportunity here, cleaned out his brother's safe, stole a horse, and joined them. So Roy Bean arrives in Texas for the first time again. His scraggled beard beginning to gray. He had survived a murder warrant, 2 duels, and a prison break before the age of 40. Now it was finally time to settle down, start a family, and build an honest life for himself. Well, sort of. Roy arrives in San Antonio and spends the rest of the war running the Union naval blockade, hauling cotton to British ships off the coast of Matamoros. In 1866, he married 18-year-old Virginia Chavez. They had 4 children together. And during his time in San Antonio, Roy worked various jobs with varying degrees of legitimacy. He was a teamster. He was a lumberjack, started a firewood business, but using stolen timber. He was a dairyman, but he was caught watering down the milk. And he was a butcher of rustled cattle. His business exploits earned his whole neighborhood the moniker Beanville. And after a few years of this, with his marriage in shambles and the law catching up to him again, Roy sold all his possessions for $900. He used that money to buy a tent, some wholesale supplies for resale, and 10 55-gallon barrels of whiskey. Then, leaving his wife and family behind, he headed west once again. Hey there, West Texans. While Roy Bean was slinging drinks in his saloon, kids today are building the future with code. That's right, Code Ninjas. It's where your kid can learn the in-demand skills they need to thrive in a digital world. Their fun and engaging curriculum uses games, puzzles, and real-world projects to teach kids ages 5 to 14 the fundamentals of coding, all in a safe and supportive environment. With Code Ninjas, your child can become a problem solver, a critical thinker, and a future tech whiz. Plus, summer camps are going on right now in cool subjects like Minecraft modding, Roblox game creation, AI, Lego robotics, YouTube, and more. With locations in Lubbock, Midland, and El Paso, plus all over the country, visit codeninjas.com today and claim your free trial class where your child will build their first video game. Code Ninjas, creating a world where kids write the code. Picture this. The year is 1882, and you're in a makeshift settlement known as Vinegaroon, about halfway between modern-day Sonora and Del Rio. The name itself conjures images of rough edges, biting survival, and the reality doesn't disappoint. This is a place that sprang up almost overnight, fueled by the relentless westward push of the Southern Pacific Railroad. Vinegaroon is a tent city, a chaotic patchwork of canvas and wood stretching as far as the eye can see. The railroad tracks cut through the center like a lifeline, flanked by a sea of temporary shelters. The air is thick with the smell of sweat, dust, smoke, and alcohol. This is a world where men work hard and play harder. Each day a battle against the elements, and each night a celebration of survival. The men who call Vinegaroon home are a motley crew. Railroad workers, drifters, gamblers, and outlaws, all drawn by the promise of work, or the allure of escaping something left behind. Faces weathered by sun and wind, hands calloused from hard labor, eyes that have seen too much. These are the denizens of this transient town, each with a story etched in the lines of their faces. The sounds of hammers and saws ring out, only to be drowned out by the engines and whistles of trains arriving and departing. Voices shout out over the noise, deals are struck, and arguments flare up only to be settled with fists or firearms. This is a place where life is cheap, and justice is a concept as mutable as the desert wind. In the center of it all stands a tent saloon. It's a hub of activity, a beacon for those seeking a drink, a game of cards, or a front row seat to whatever violence is in store tonight. Vinegaroon is a place of contrasts, a microcosm of the American frontier spirit. It's a place where hope and desperation walk hand in hand, where the promise of progress is shadowed by the harsh reality of survival. It's a town at the edge of civilization. And for a man like Roy Bean, it's a place to carve out a legacy or lose everything. So this is the world that Roy found himself in when he arrived in Pecos County, Texas, in the rough and tumble railroad camp where he first set up shop. If you've seen the series Hell on Wheels, you've got a really good idea of what Vinegaroon would have looked like. These end-of-the-tracks railroad camps, as one Texas Ranger put it, quote, attracted the worst lot of roughs, gamblers, robbers, and pickpockets I ever saw, end quote. So crossing the Pecos River Canyon was the last big engineering challenge to completing the Southern Transcontinental Railroad route, linking New Orleans to Los Angeles, up to San Francisco. This route is still in use today. You can hop on an Amtrak and ride through these same areas right now if you want to. When Roy arrived in Vinegaroon, he pitched his tent, unloaded his whiskey barrels, and just like that, he had a saloon. It was a prime spot to sell drinks, gambling, and supplies to the more than 8,000 railroad workers camped nearby. Now, to call this place lawless would be an understatement. Law-free might be more correct, because there was literally no law. There was no police, no courts, no government whatsoever. Things got so bad that the Texas Rangers were called in from other parts of the state to try to get a handle on the crime. But even when they arrested someone, they had to make a 400-mile round trip to Fort Stockton just to have a trial. So the Rangers made a plea to the county commissioners, let's establish a new justice of the peace here. Their nomination for the post? The most reputable man they knew in the area. Reputable being a very relative term here. That's right, Roy Bean. So with no formal education, much less any training in the law whatsoever, Roy Bean became Judge Roy Bean, Justice of the Peace, Precinct 6, Pecos County, Texas, on August 2nd, 1882. Not one to wait around, he had actually tried his first case 2 weeks earlier. Without a courthouse, Roy's saloon became the courthouse. He soon figured out that the saloon was a little busier on days when he conducted legal business. In a place with no entertainment outside of a card game, a makeshift courthouse might as well have been Carnegie Hall. So Roy leaned on his natural affinity for showmanship. His rulings were a mix of common sense, humor, and sheer audacity. He started enlisting his best customers as jurors, always insisting they buy a round during recesses and after sentencing. Once, Roy was called to conduct an inquest at the site of a bridge collapse near Vinegaroon where 10 men had fallen. He rode over on a donkey and pronounced all 10 men dead at the scene, even though 3 of them still clung to life. When corrected, Roy said that, well, the others will soon die, and he didn't want to have to make the trip again. $5 coroner's fee notwithstanding. To Roy's embarrassment, all 3 men pulled through. Lucky guys. So where there had been no law just weeks earlier, Roy now fined men for petty offenses, often keeping the fines for himself. His sole legal reference was the 1879 edition of the Revised Statutes of Texas, though it's doubtful he ever read it. Roy was sent updated law books over the years, but he absolutely refused to use anything other than the 1879 edition, claiming it was all the law he needed. The others were reportedly used as kindling in his stove. In one case, an Irishman shot and killed a Chinese railroad laborer and was brought to court for murder. A mob of 200 angry Irishmen surrounded the saloon, threatening to lynch Roy if their compatriot wasn't freed. Not wishing to be hung again, and knowing that the Irishmen frequented his saloon while the Chinese did not, Roy calmly flipped through his legal book before pronouncing that homicide in the state of Texas is defined as the killing of a human being, but he could, quote, find no law against the killing of a Chinaman, end quote. The case was dismissed, and the Irish mob celebrated their victory, that's right, at his saloon. By the end of 1882, railroad construction had moved further west, and Vinegaroon began to die. So wasting no time, Roy packed up his tent and moved his operation 70 miles away to the town of Strawbridge, now known as Sanderson. He didn't find Strawbridge very welcoming, though. It already had an established saloon, and the owner secretly laced all of Roy's whiskey with kerosene. Yeah, time to move on. He tried again at the nearby town of Langtry, Texas, with a local landowner also being a saloon owner and refusing to give any land to a competitor. Roy just set up shop right next to the railroad tracks on the railroad's right-of-way. It was there that he built what would become his world-famous Jersey Lilly Saloon on railroad land that he didn't own. So by the time Roy rolled into Langtry, he was pushing 50, ready to finally settle down somewhere. I feel like we've said that a lot. He ditched the dusty tent life and built a proper saloon. Now, forget those sprawling saloons you see in movies. The Jersey Lilly was tiny, barely 500 square feet. Imagine a long single room, no insulation, with rough wooden walls you could stick your finger through. Up one end, a ladder led to a tiny loft where Roy probably slept like a sardine. Down at the other end, the bar, of course. Whiskey, beer, maybe some tequila. That's probably about all you'd find. Behind the bar hung a picture of Lily Langtry, the British actress and namesake of the whole place. There was also a sign on the wall that said, Argumentum ad judicum. Now, Roy wasn't exactly a Latin scholar, so he'd tell curious folks it meant, don't argue with the judge, which wasn't exactly right, but hey, it got the point across. A few beat-up tables and benches filled the rest of the space, each one carved up hundreds of times with Bowie knives. The Lily also had a big porch out front, and Roy was known to hold court out there whenever he felt like it. Now, if Roy's judge act in Vinegaroon was kind of funny for the locals, in Langtry, he went full-blown P.T. Barnum with his theatrics and shenanigans. Back then, there was a saying, there's no law west of the Pecos and no God west of El Paso. Roy, ever the opportunist, decided to fill that void. He started calling himself the law west of the Pecos. Maybe he even dreamed of becoming the God west of El Paso someday, but hey, judge work for now. To attract thirsty train passengers, Roy plastered his bar with hand-painted signs. At first, it was simple stuff like ice, beer, the Jersey Lilly, hanging from the porch roof. But as Roy's fame and ego grew, so did the signs. Soon they covered the entire roof and stretched across the whole front of the building. The biggest sign declared Judge Roy Bean, Notary Public, Justice of the Peace, Law west of the Pecos. The last part was all caps, twice the size of everything else, and right above the doorway. Talk about making a statement. Just like in Vinegaroon, Roy's legal expertise came from a single book, the 1879 Revised Statutes. And forget gavels. Roy used his trusty .41 revolver to rap for attention. Jury duty? Well, you couldn't serve if you weren't drinking, and trials were conveniently held in the afternoons and evenings. Peak drinking hours, of course. Now, Langtry didn't have a jail, so if you got sentenced, you were chained to an oak tree outside the Lily. But most punishments came in the form of fines, which suited Roy just fine. Often the fine for bad behavior was simply buying a round of drinks for the jury. Funny how the fines often ended up being the exact amount of cash the accused had on them. Roy's court was basically a one-man show to benefit himself, but he also had this weird patriotic thing going on with Texas. I mean, who doesn't? He'd talk about it like a woman he was protecting, spouting lines like, you've offended the great state of Texas by committing this crime on her sacred soil, before sentencing someone. This love for Texas didn't extend to remitting any of his collected fines back to the state, though. And even though justices of the peace couldn't legally grant divorces, Roy did them anyway. Weddings were a steal at $5, but divorces cost double. And every wedding ceremony ended with a cheery, "And may God have mercy on your souls." And one of my favorite wrinkles in the story is Bruno. Bruno was a black bear that Roy acquired under circumstances that, like many of these stories, are a little bit hazy. Some accounts suggest that he won Bruno in a poker game, while others imply that he bought him from a traveling circus that had fallen on hard times. Either way, Bruno became a fixture at the Jersey Lilly. Visitors to the saloon were often taken aback by the sight of a bear chained outside or lounging inside the establishment. Roy even encouraged patrons to buy him a beer at the astronomical price of $1 each to give to Bruno. The bear would work the cork out with his paws and teeth before chugging the whole thing in front of the delighted travelers. Best dollar they ever spent, right? Had to be. But Bruno wasn't just for show. He also served as an unofficial bouncer. There are numerous tales of Bruno deterring troublemakers just by being there. One such story involves a particularly rowdy drunk who was causing a disturbance in the Lilly. Roy, seeing the potential for escalation, casually instructed Bruno to escort the man outside. The bear, responding to his master's command, approached the drunk, who quickly sobered up at the sight of the imposing creature and left without incident. Bruno's presence also played into Roy's courtroom theatrics. During trials, when defendants or witnesses became unruly, Roy would point to Bruno as a silent reminder to behave. The threat of being left alone with the bear was often enough to keep even the most recalcitrant individuals in line. Despite the fear Bruno instilled in some, he was generally a well-behaved and even-tempered bear, particularly when Roy was around. The two had an undeniable bond, and Bruno seemed to understand his role in Roy's particular brand of justice. By 1883, about the time the railroad track was completed, stories of Roy's antics were beginning to spread regionally. A reporter from the San Antonio Express had ventured to Langtry to see it for himself, and he wrote a scandalous article describing customer shakedowns, theft of fines and court fees, and releasing charged criminals just because it appeared they didn't have money for fines. He described Roy drunkenly brandishing his revolver during court, causing such a scene that the Texas Rangers had to take his gun away and shackle him until he could sober up and continue proceedings the next day. Aside from his, quote, bibulous peculiarities, the reporter noted, quote, old Roy is generous, brave, courteous, and a keen lover of fun. He holds court anywhere and carries a pocket full of blank warrants, one of which he will fill out and sign at a moment's notice. Now, as Roy's fame continued to grow, so did the stories of his bizarre brand of justice. Travelers passing through Langtry would often stop to see the legendary judge in action. His saloon became filled with travelers, locals, and curiosity seekers, all eager to witness the spectacle of Judge Roy Bean. He was known to show particular contempt for East Coast city dudes, his words, that would arrive on the train from time to time. One such story, described in Frontier Times magazine in 1948, tells of one of these men strolling in the Lilly and ordering a beer. Oblige me with a glass, suggested the customer. Drink it out the bottle or leave it alone, Bean countered. My mistake, said the dude, and he drained the bottle. He cast a scornful eye at the resplendent sign, ice cold beer, and asked, how near the ice do you keep this beer? Bean snorted. Whoever heard tell of ice in the summertime? The visitor dropped a $20 gold piece on the bar. Bean chucked it into the cash drawer. My change? The gentleman queried. You don't get no change. Any galoot that comes into my bailiwick and puts down a $20 gold piece and expects to get change back ought to have a guardeen. But my good man, that's robbery, protested the Easterner. Is there no law in this country? I'm the law, said the judge dryly. He took off his bar apron, shrugged into his judicial garment, and mounted the chair of justice. I find you guilty of disorderly conduct and fine you $10 in costs. The cost will be $9. Court is adjourned. The judge descended from the bench and became the bailiff. With the $1 you owe me for the beer, that makes $20, which has already been paid into the treasury of the honorable court, he explained. The prisoner is discharged, and you better run for that train. It's about to pull out, and we don't aim to harbor no disorderly persons in this town. The young man ran. Another story relates a man who entered the Jersey Lilly limping with a cane, with a sob story about his handicap, passing around a hat for patrons to make donations to him. After a while, he thanked the crowd and ambled off into the night. Two curious boys from the town followed him and witnessed him returning to his buddies camped outside of town, no longer crippled. They all laughed about the suckers in the saloon. Well, the boys ran to Judge Roy, who quickly deputized some bar patrons to go bring this man back. When they returned with the con man, Roy had them flay him out on the pool table and cut one of his pant legs off at the knee. The judge told his right-hand man, "Domingo, underlay, triega la sarucha," and informed the man that he intended to cut his leg off and make him a real cripple. After a long production of marking the man's leg with a carpenter's pencil and arguing about how high they should cut it off, the mob decided they should turn around and go ahead and have a drink at the bar before continuing the amputation. The man took his opportunity and ran straight out of town. He jumped into the Rio Grande and swam across. He was never seen in Langtry again. His appointment up, Roy was elected Justice of the Peace in 1884, but lost the next election in 1886, 25 votes to 17. He raised such a fuss that the next year, 1887, the county commissioners created a new precinct and appointed Roy as Justice of the Peace there. In 1896, rival saloon owner Jesus Torres was declared the winner after Roy received more votes than the number of qualified voters. But Roy still refused to hand over his notary public seal or the law book. So the two men reached a compromise in which each would handle cases on their side of the railroad tracks. In the 1898 election, Roy chased Torres voters from the polls with a shotgun, prompting the Del Rio sheriff to intervene, threatening to change the judge to his bear. Roy would lose that race, but win the next two in 1900 and 1902. But win or lose, drunk or sober, he continued to hold court whenever it suited him. Now, Bean and Torres had been enemies ever since Roy had arrived in Langtry. Torres owned all the land in town and refused to grant any to a competitor like Roy, which is how Roy became a squatter on the railroad easement. Not content to suffer defeat, Torres also denied Roy use of the only potable water in the area, a natural spring located on his land. Undeterred, though, Roy just stole any water he needed from the railroad tanks nearby. Their feud went on for decades until in his later years, Torres converted his saloon to a general merchandise store. No longer in competition, the two community leaders actually became close friends. In 1890, Roy received word that railroad magnate Jay Gould, one of the richest men in the world at that time, would be passing through Langtry, but his train wasn't scheduled to stop there. So Roy, using a railroad danger signal flag, alerted the train as it steamed through town. The conductor, assuming the upcoming high bridge was out, engaged the emergency brakes, bringing the train to a stop. Roy, long white beard, dark leathery skin, and his favorite wide-brimmed sombrero probably looked more like a bandito than a respected magistrate and community leader. Guards with shotguns jumped off the train and approached Roy. Roy removed his sombrero and asked them if Mr. Gould was aboard. Before any of them could answer, Gould appeared on the platform and asked him what he wanted. "I'm Roy Bean," he said, "the law west of the Pecos, and I want to shake your hand. Won't you get out and say howdy?" Mr. Gould, some aides, and his daughter exited the train, and Roy invited them to his saloon where they stayed, talking, drinking, laughing for over 2 hours. Now, the Langtry station agent had telegraphed that the train had passed through Langtry without incident, but had never amended his message after the train stopped. The station agent actually followed the group into the saloon. So when the train never arrived at the next station as scheduled, a frantic telegraph operator assumed that it really had plummeted off the high bridge. By the time Gould's train left, word of the supposed crash had gotten out at the speed of telegraph, and his railroad stock had suffered a panic sell-off on the New York Stock Exchange. Thanks, Roy. Once the station agent returned to his post and responded to the frantic telegraph messages, by now threatening his job if he didn't respond, the crisis was averted. I love his reply. Quote, "JG, stop. Been visiting with Roy Bean and me. Stop. Been eating ladyfingers and drinking champagne. Stop. Take your old job and go to hell. Stop. Train just left. Stop." One of Roy's biggest and most legendary stunts, though, came in 1896. Wanting to attract tourism to the area, he negotiated with two boxing superstars of the day, Bob Fitzsimmons and Peter Marr, to stage a world championship heavyweight title fight in Langtry, Texas. One small problem, though. Like much of the U.S. at the time, Texas had outlawed boxing. It was also outlawed in Mexico. Undeterred as usual, Roy built a makeshift boxing ring on a sandbar in the middle of the Rio Grande. He had crews build a temporary bridge out to the ring, and brought in spectators and press from all over the country to see the fight. Some Texas Rangers were even his invited guests. Though the fight only lasted 90 seconds, news of Roy's audacity quickly spread throughout the country, gaining him immediate notoriety and nationwide, if not worldwide fame. Newspapers loved to print tales of his judicial shenanigans. And in the ensuing years and many Hollywood performances, Roy Bean has earned a reputation as somewhat of a ruthless hanging judge. But that's not a portrait that history actually backs up. In fact, it's not clear if he ever actually hanged anyone. The closest he may have come was staging a mock hanging of a gun thief off the back of a rail car. But like the crippled con man, he allowed the perpetrator to escape. He regularly let off horse thieves with a fine if they simply returned the horse, and that was a hangable crime anywhere else in the West. Local accounts at the time report that he made sure that local widows, as well as the school in Langtry, always had firewood for the winter. He was known to keep a list of the local children so that he could make sure each of them received a Christmas present. He served as a trustee of the local school and would never allow children inside the Jersey Lilly. Though he never reconciled with his ex-wife, his children were known to come and go between Langtry and elsewhere. He even built a house across the street from the saloon. He had always been content to sleep in the bar, but didn't find it fit for his kids to spend their nights sleeping on a billiards table. He never remarried, and I couldn't find really any mention linking him with other women in Langtry, except, of course, with Lilly Langtry. He was known to talk about her often. He apparently wrote her a series of letters inviting her to come visit him in the town he named after her. That was a lie. And to perform in the new opera house he had built. The opera house didn't exist, not really, but he did put one of his famous hand-painted signs on top of his own home, styling it Roy Bean's Opera House, Town Hall, and Seat of Justice. Roy would die in 1903 at the age of 70 in his bed at Langtry, reportedly of heart problems. He's buried in Del Rio. His children sold the Jersey Lilly and the Opera House to a local rancher, Will Ike Babb. Will and his wife lived in the Opera House and stored hay at the saloon. Will had planned to dismantle the saloon and use the wood on his ranch, but his wife stopped him, quoted as saying, "There's going to be people coming to see that someday." One person in particular, though, did come to see it. In 1904, just months after Roy's passing, a train arrived, carrying none other than Lilly Langtry. She didn't stay long. The Sunset Limited only stopped in Langtry for 20 to 30 minutes to fill its boilers, but she had time to visit the Jersey Lilly, describing it and her visit in her autobiography years later. Langtry citizens also reported that she made a $50 donation to help expand the schoolhouse next to the Lilly after seeing how overcrowded it was. In her book, she describes reboarding the train to see, quote, "the strange sight of a huge cinnamon bear careering across the line, dragging a cowboy at the end of a long chain," end quote. Some local boys had taken over Bruno's care, and I guess they thought the bear would make a fine gift to Ms. Langtry. She was known as an animal lover. She continues in her book, quote, "They hoisted the unwilling animal onto the platform and tethered him to the rail, but happily, before I had time to rid myself of this unwelcome addition without seeming discourteous, he broke away, scattering the crowd and causing some of the vaqueros to start shooting wildly at all angles," end quote. In 1935, on the eve of the Texas Centennial, the Del Rio Chamber of Commerce alerted the state that tourists were stealing wood and other souvenirs from the Jersey Lilly. After a negotiation with the Babbs and the Southern Pacific Railroad, the land still ostensibly belonged to the railroad, the Jersey Lilly was gifted to the Texas Highway Department in 1936. The Jersey Lilly was restored and reopened to tourists in 1939. Today, visitors can tour the Lilly, the Opera House, and even inspect Roy's law book, hold his revolver, aka gavel, his handcuffs, his notary public seal, and his walking stick. Judge Roy Bean's legacy, like that of most Old West figures, was complicated. So I'll just wrap up with the thoughts of two of his contemporaries on the judge. Beulah Birdwell Farley, who lived with her family near his opera house, told biographer Jack Scowls, quote, "Roy Bean was a smart old booger. He had his faults, but listen, he was a good man at heart. He might have been a murderer and a robber and a thief, but he was good in his own way. He was the best-hearted old fellow you ever saw," end quote. U.S. District Court Judge T.A. Falvey summed up the man for the El Paso Herald in 1914, quote, That man did a world of good. He was the man for the place. The rough community where he had settled would have tolerated no enforcement of the law as it was printed on the statute books. But they tolerated Bean, because he was both law and equity, right and justice. He filled a place that could not have been filled by any other man. His decisions were not always according to the law and the fact, but they were accepted, and that was the big point. Roy Bean's part in the pioneer history of West Texas cannot be written in a page. He was what he claimed to be. The law west of the Pecos. You've been listening to the WTX podcast. I'm Jody Slaughter. You can find this and future episodes on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Visit our website at wtxpodcast.com for companion articles, show notes, and photos for each episode. Yes, you can see Bruno there. To get a hold of me with questions, comments, or show ideas, you can email me at lubbokist@gmail.com or on Twitter at Lubbokist. That's LUBBOCKIST. This episode was written, produced, engineered, and edited by me, Jody Slaughter. Music featured in this episode came from Nylonia, Gabriel Lewis, River Run Dry, Ardonna MP, and Gentry Ford and the Homeless Lobos. You can find our theme song, It's All West Texas, by Gentry Ford and the Homeless Lobos on their new album, West Texas Werewolves, wherever you stream music. Thanks for listening, and until next time, so long from West Texas.
To argue about where West Texas begins. Some think it's Fort Worth, somewhere near the cattle pens. Some think it's I-35 packed with Fords and Chevrolets. Others think it's where the oak trees start to fade to sand and clay. Straight once and for all. It's all West Texas. It's all West Texas. Whether you're surrounded by John Deere's or Lexus, congrats, you're in West Texas. And Pecos Valley purists think they've got the winning hand, but they ain't gonna paint me as some Eastern Yankee man. It's all West Texas. It's all West Texas. Whether you're surrounded by John Deere's or Lexus, congrats, you're in West Texas. Tyler, Seattle, Springfield, Chicago, Manhattan, Miami, Toronto.